We now come to a debate on E-petition 329, 339 and 332-789 about support for live events and weddings during Covid-19. Elliot Colburn to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 329-339 relating to the number of guests permitted at weddings during the coronavirus pandemic, and E-petition 332-789 relating to support for nightclubs, festivals and the live events industry. Mr Gray, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I thank all honourable and right honourable members for a full Westminster Hall debate on this Petitions Committee debate this afternoon. If I can turn first to the petition on weddings, this is particularly important to me because I myself have had to postpone my wedding that I was supposed to have in July. But before I go on to lament about that, I think it's important to note exactly what we're debating this afternoon. Just over 110,000 people so far have signed this petition, including 150 of my own constituents in Carshalton and Wallington, and the prayer of the petition states the following. Weddings take months, even years of intricate planning. Myself and a number of others believe that the maximum number of guests authorised at wedding ceremonies should be increased. The number of guests permitted should be calculated according to venue capacity. For instance, if a venue has a capacity of 600 people, social distancing could still be practised with a fifth of this number. People should not have to alter their plans if social distancing is observed. Surely, if beaches are allowed to remain open, weddings should be permitted to go ahead, considering appropriate measures are put in place. It is more than apparent that social distancing is not practised at such public places, thus guidelines for weddings should be reconsidered. Now, at present, as the government outlined in their response, before we entered into a second national lockdown, weddings could take place, but numbers were restricted to 15 or 30 people. Now, once again, sadly, weddings are restricted to deathbed weddings alone. But I would like to pick up something with the Minister that I have heard some rather worrying testimony from Professor Sandberg from Cardiff University, who has pointed out to me that apparently across the country there has been varying interpretation of this guidance, with some areas insisting that deathbed weddings can only take place in a hospital setting, which has denied some couples the ability to tie the knot in really tragic circumstances. So I'd be glad if the Minister could take that away and pick that up. Now, I understand some of the arguments that have been made. Some have been directed at me after my own wedding got cancelled, that two people who are in love shouldn't need a big event to get married, that they can have smaller ceremonies now and leave a big party until later, and that people will always need to get married and therefore the wedding events industry will survive. But I think these arguments fail to acknowledge a few key difficulties, such as the planning involved in putting a wedding on, the wider effect that it has on the industry, and indeed some of the traditions that are associated with weddings. And this last point can be demonstrated by the petitioner herself, Zaina Ali, who tells her story. She states that, my brother was due to get married in August, and coming from an Asian Pakistani background, we had planned this big wedding and had been doing so for well over a year. It is with great sadness, anger, and every other relating emotion. I guess what made it even more emotional was the fact that my brother's wife had lost her dad to cancer when she was a baby. The fact that her father couldn't be there for her big day was heartbreaking enough, but the fact that my grandparents couldn't give her away in true Pakistani style made it that much harder. They felt like they'd almost failed her father. There were also a few personal reasons as to why we did not want to postpone the wedding, and I'm sure many are in the same situation. And I can confirm that many indeed are. My own wedding was, due to the number of guests we'd hoped to have, had to be postponed. Like many others, we had planned for over 2 years, actually. And by postponing, this didn't just have an effect on us, it also had an effect on the caterers, the florists, the decorators, entertainment, marquee companies, and everyone else involved in putting a wedding on. And I've spoken to some local businesses, like the Function Junction in Wallington, who supply things like decorations for weddings and live events, who tell me that while some people, like myself, have decided to postpone and use their same supplier, many, due to the uncertainty of that the coronavirus pandemic has brought, have decided to instead just to cancel altogether and not set a new date. That's both leaving the couple devastated, but also leaving businesses out of pocket. And now, according to research, the industry has already lost most of its planned weddings for the first quarter for 2021 and are facing pressures on the second. If there's no commitment before July, the sector tells me that they will lose most of its revenue up to June 2021 or beyond, and even run the risk of collapsing fully. Therefore, my ask would be that the government looks carefully at liberalising the restrictions around weddings once we come out of this second national lockdown, and additionally set out a roadmap for reopening the wedding industry in the longer term. Now, we hope and pray that a vaccine will allow weddings to take place normally again sometime soon, and indeed we've had some good news today. But we must also have a plan B for living longer term with the virus. Therefore, I would argue, like the petitioners, that this could begin after lockdown by amending guidance on weddings to allow for greater guest capacity based on the venue. Many countries in Europe, for example, have permitted weddings with socially distanced numbers, some capped at, say, 100, in the equivalent of what would be our Tier 1 or lower environments. And even here in the UK, Northern Ireland has operated socially distanced weddings since June, until the more recent restrictions were brought in. They were granted parity with hospitality, and there are no known outbreaks associated with weddings in Northern Ireland. So I think this example does prove that it can work. But also in the longer term, weddings to me seem like the perfect place to trial rapid testing, because given the planning involved, they're relatively easy to share details prior to the event, conduct testing on arrival if necessary, and indeed test and trace after the event has taken place. So I hope that that will also be considered as a potential pilot for rapid testing. Now, I've spoken about the impact of the pandemic on the industry, and further restrictions and uncertainty will only cause further damage. So a commitment to socially distanced weddings, to rapid testing trials, and equitable support for the wedding industry with other hospitality businesses will help to deliver a bounce back for this industry. Now, if I can turn to the e-petition on live events. To date, just over 145,000 people have signed this petition, including 236 from my own Carshalton and Wallington constituency. And the prayer of this petition states that the government has failed to provide significant support to UK festivals, dance venues and nightclubs. Covid-19 has hit hard on the nightlife sector, having had a major impact due to the suspension of mass gatherings. Followed by unclear guidelines and a lack of commitment, this has contributed to growing uncertainty within the arts sector and put millions of jobs at risk. The government must make clear its commitment to ensuring the dance community survives the pandemic. #LetUsDance. Now, in preparing for this debate, I'm extremely grateful to the lead petitioners, Jasper and Anthony, as well as the Nighttime Industries Association, for taking the time to share their concerns with me and explain the issues that the sector are facing in a bit more detail. And the figures are quite stark. The nighttime economy is the UK's 5th largest sector. It contributes £66 billion per year to the economy, which is 6% of the UK total, and provides in the region of 1.3 million jobs, alongside an entire supply line of creative freelancers, sole traders and skilled technicians. And significant parts of this sector, unlike other hospitality businesses, have not been able to open at all since lockdown in March, particularly nightclubs I'm thinking of in this example. Now, some venues have indeed invested heavily in becoming COVID secure or even repurposed. However, even those venues have only been able to trade at a fraction of the capacity that they were able to before. And also, many have raised concerns about the implementation of the arbitrary 10 p.m. curfew. Now we are facing another national lockdown and the uncertainty is growing, and indeed there is calls from the sector for an urgent set of sector-specific support packages. Now, prior to the new national lockdown, there was a survey commissioned by the Nighttime Industries Association and their members, and there were some pretty devastating statistics coming out of that survey. 72% of businesses said that they were unable to open or trade. 58% feared that they would not survive longer than 2 months after a job retention scheme came to an end. 71% said that they were set to make more than half of their workforce redundant. Just a third said that they were able to repurpose. The average cost of repurposing was anywhere between £10,000 and £30,000. And 84% of businesses were only achieving 10 to 50% of their normal trade. And as I said, this was on top of growing concerns about the implementation of a 10 p.m. curfew. It was seen that the nighttime economy, for many, was the target of restrictions, despite PHE evidence indicating that infection transmissions in hospitality was only around 4%. The danger was that the curfew could drive people to congregate in the streets and in mass gatherings outside, or even continue their night in unsafe, unregulated and illegal gatherings behind closed doors. And I've spoken to hospitality businesses in Carshalton and Wallington who've expressed similar concerns to me. Popular local businesses like the Ginger Italian and the Duke's Head and others, thankfully have had their loyal customers come back to them once hospitality was allowed to partially reopen. But it was felt that the 10 p.m. curfew was really stunting their ability to be able to recover. There have also been further concerns about the allocation of support grants and packages, as there were fears that the contemporary dance music scene was not taken into account properly when it came to funding allocations by the Arts Council. Now, nighttime businesses and their supply chains, I think it's fair to say, have recognised that they need to put public health first, and they've worked incredibly hard to make themselves COVID safe for when that happens. But they do need clarity in the form of a roadmap to reopening so that they can prepare financially for this to happen. And then in terms of their finances, the NTIA has got a number of asks. This includes employment support guaranteeing 80% of wages to continue, an extension of the self-employed income support scheme, a sector-specific grant system proportionate to the operating costs of frontline businesses and the supply chain, a workable commercial rent solution, a reduced rate of VAT for hospitality throughout 2021, and a business rates holiday for 21-22, and ultimately that all-important exit strategy from lockdown. Now, there are fears amongst the industry that without these measures, we do risk losing our nightlife and indeed our cultural heritage for good. So again, whilst I say that the news today is good, and we do hope that a vaccine might be fast coming to allow some semblance of normality to come back again, we do have to have a plan for both of these sectors to live with the virus. Repeated lockdowns, as the government itself has said, are not the answer, and further restrictions could well mean that the industry is not there to recover at the end. So in both of these cases, I would urge the government to look carefully at the concerns raised by the industry, look at the support that could be made available in the short term, but most importantly, both for weddings and for live events, set out that clear roadmap for reopening so that these businesses can begin to bounce back.
The question is, this House considered the e-petitions relating to support for live events and weddings during Covid-19. I'm asked to advise the House, if you want a clean cup, there are cups at the back of the room if you want to avail yourself of them. A glance around the chamber will demonstrate that there are a large number of people seeking to speak. But rather than impose a formal time limit, which I think substitutes quality for quantity, it might be courteous to other members if people restrict themselves to roughly 3 minutes per head, if that's allowed from now onwards. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Chair, and may I thank the honourable member for Carls, Halton and Wallington for clearly setting out the case for urgent support of the weddings and live events sector. One of my constituents recently stated to me that music is part of this country's rich fabric, its heart and soul. And those words really resonated with me, not least because of my own constituency's rich musical and artistic heritage. From Ewan McColl to Manchester, we've long relied upon a blossoming nighttime and live events economy, and we've been very proud of it. But the last 6 months have pushed many across this sector into extreme financial hardship, from the complete closure of many live venues through to the exclusion of many businesses and freelancers from the Chancellor's business support schemes. Indeed, Excluded UK estimate that there are over 3 million excluded from any government business support at all, and the Nighttime Industries Association stated that recent announcements have given some light, but we have lost so many businesses, employees and self-employed already. We are still in a very vulnerable state. The weddings and events industry is equally vulnerable. In some cases, venues were able to reopen in a limited capacity as lockdown eased. Others had to remain closed completely. Within my constituency, there are places like Odsall Hall and Salford Lads Club that both do weddings and live events, as well as numerous venues beyond the city employing my constituents, such as Samsbury Hall. These venues employ a number of staff, as well as all the suppliers along the way, from the table place holders to the wedding dress to the cakes and flowers. Many weddings take years of planning and are now being postponed because couples understandably want all their family and friends to be part of what should be one of the most magical and happy events of their lives. Even if such venues were somehow able to reopen fully tomorrow, safely and with no restrictions, these events take years of planning and simply cannot be resumed at short notice. Couples are now contacting venues and suppliers to request rearranging their bookings to 2021. But if these businesses cannot survive the pandemic, then rebookings will be heartbreakingly irrelevant. The live event sector, such as trade shows and exhibitions, has been affected in similar measures, and I'm sad to report that absence of sector-specific support thus far has meant that redundancies have already occurred in my constituency, from joiners to designers who have no idea when they'll be able to secure work again. So I'd therefore be grateful if the Minister could address the following concerns urgently. Firstly, will he commit today to working with these sectors to develop sector-specific support packages? Will he commit to delivering a roadmap towards the resumption of normal business in a logical, COVID-secure way, so that there's clarity for the future of businesses, employees and their customers? Will he review further VAT exemptions that could support affected businesses in these sectors? Will he backdate and provide equitable support to all the wedding businesses and live events venues, at least in line with other hospitality businesses? Will he urgently address the significant number of venues who have still not received any support from the Cultural Recovery Fund? And finally, will he urgently commit to implementing a financial support package to protect the 3 million businesses, workers and self-employed people excluded from any government support so far? Thank you, Chair.
Good night.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I wish to congratulate my honourable friend from Wallington and Carshalton for securing this important debate. He's proving to be a considerable upgrade. The NEC is one of the most renowned venues in the West Midlands and nationally on the edges of my constituency, paying host to conferences and concerts alike. Last month they announced they were cutting 450 jobs because of the ongoing uncertainty. That is the reality for so many events businesses in this country right now. Since March, concerts have become a distant memory. Sports clubs have supplemented their business by paying host to weddings, have found that even when they were briefly able to open in the late summer, their major sources of income have been cut off. I know of one golf club which has lost almost £500,000 in wedding business. Nightclubs and jazz bars remain shuttered, while the musicians, event staff, sound engineers and DJs who work so hard to bring us top-notch entertainment are furloughed, redundant, or desperately trying to make up money they'd have lost in other industries. And to be frank with you, there aren't that many jobs going around if you are looking in alternative employment. And also there are major black spots when it comes to self-employed, something that my committee has highlighted at length. There are wider impacts too. Would we have seen the likes of the much-missed Amy Winehouse had she not been able to perform those early gigs in North London? Our emerging talent depends on live events and relies heavily on the income they provide to keep investing in their own talent. The Cultural Recovery Fund is welcome money for the arts, Mr Chair, and I recognise that the government's furlough scheme has been a lifeline for millions of jobs where businesses have been able to operate. But live events and their reliance on having large numbers of people in one place, often in an enclosed space, in order to make a profit, is inherently incompatible with restrictions on COVID-19. The £1.57 billion does not even come close to touching the sides of the losses sustained this year, and is divided into such a large number of diverse types of arts business already. Live venues need ongoing support that recognises their precarious position and clear timelines that will allow them to prepare to reopen like no earlier than dates. In normal times, these are profitable businesses, with events accounting for half of all inbound UK tourist spend and 70 billion in direct spending. That is why my committee has called for bespoke sector-specific support. The government's provided this for theatres and arts venues on the brink. It now needs to do the same for live events.
Honourable members will know that Newcastle has a globally renowned nighttime economy, and our nightlife is a big attraction for locals, for tourists and for prospective students. Newcastle's pubs and clubs are concentrated into clusters that have developed their own character, from the upmarket quayside to the down-to-earth Oosburn to the famous big market to the Pink Triangle. There's something for everybody, and a very warm welcome usually awaits. And I'm proud that Newcastle also hosts some iconic venues like World Headquarters, a pioneering progressive underground club where I have to admit I spent much of my 20s. It has a long and rich history going back decades in Newcastle, and venues like this are the fabric of Newcastle and the North East, helping to make us into the thriving, multicultural, cohesive community that we are proud to be. These are not dispensable businesses that we can allow to wither and die during this pandemic. We cannot assume that we'll just resume to normal business and they'll be replaced with shiny new venues and all will be well. If these businesses don't survive the pandemic, we'll be losing our city's character, part of our history, the thing that makes Newcastle what it is. The way to stop that is to give the support now, and the government's decision to include clubs in the restriction support grant is a belated acknowledgement that they have not been able to generate any income for 8 months. But ministers know that £3,000 a month for those that get the most of it will not be enough to cover the backdated losses that many of these places have faced. I want the government to look at building in flexibility into the local restriction support grant. The nighttime economy is in crisis, and we know that not every business will survive, but local authorities have the local knowledge and intelligence to be able to know where that money can be best spent. This petition is called Let Us Dance. People don't expect to go back dancing in nightclubs straight away, but they do want them to still be standing when they can go and celebrate when this pandemic is over. If we allow our nighttime economy to fail, we'll lose part of our character, part of our history that has grown organically over time. It can't just be replaced. We should not just leave a vacuum that will be filled with who knows what sort of business. Without support, I think we'll be a poorer city financially and in spirit, and the government should not want that to happen as much as I don't want to see it.
Anderson Liu.
Thank you, Mr Gray. The government is allowing deathbed weddings during this period of second lockdown, but I would please make a plea to extend that provision for deathbed weddings to where parents or siblings of the bride or groom are terminally ill and are not expected to live beyond the 2nd of December. My own mother wasn't able to come to my wedding when I was married many years ago because she was in hospital at the time, but she was able to watch it on a video afterwards. For people not expected to live perhaps another 2 or 3 weeks, I would just please ask the government to go back. They could be the minimum legal number of 5, the couple, the minister celebrant, and 2 witnesses. But I do think that would be a real kindness to that very small number of people, and I would please ask the Minister, who I know tries very hard on this type of issue, to take that issue back, just to see if we can do something about that. The weddings industry is a £10 billion business in this country, supporting an enormous amount of employment. Yet we have wedding venues, one in my own constituency, which did not manage to receive the Small Business Support Grant or the Retail, Hospitality, Tourism and Leisure Grant. Neither did they receive the discretionary grant at all. So there are some wedding venues which have fallen through the cracks. There's been great difficulty for couples where insurance has excluded cancellation on the grounds of government guidance alone. And some couples have been charged an 80% cancellation fee, which I think is entirely unreasonable, and no one should be forced to effectively pay 180% of the cost of their wedding to get married the second time round. So there are some big, big issues on the weddings front. As far as the events and exhibition industry is concerned, I want to quote very briefly one of my constituents who runs an exhibition business, who said as follows: "I read, listen and watch leaders of industries bemoan the terrible impact the second lockdown is having on their businesses," which I'm very sympathetic to, and I see the government provide substantial financial support to these industries. However, I look on with some incredulity that these industries that have been able to trade in between lockdowns and have received report, yet the exhibition industry has neither been allowed to trade or received any bespoke support. We've been locked down since March 2020 and will stay locked down until at least April 2021, and yet we have received zero targeted support. And the events industry as well would echo those sentiments. And these are huge parts of our economy. In relation to business rates, the last point I'd just like to make very quickly, the government did give discretionary grants to local authorities, but there has been great variability in terms of whether local authorities have granted rates relief to exhibitions and events businesses. I know that of 40 local authorities who have, but there are others, councils, for whom I do have sympathy, who say the government has a proven track record in clawing back money that it believes has been paid out wrongly. And there, therefore, is a postcode lottery on business rates. I would please ask the Minister to give greater certainty to councils they can pay out on business rates.
Thank you, Mr Gray. First of all, I thank you for chairing today's debate, but also the 209 petitioners in my constituency who have signed the petition, those expectant couples waiting for their happy day, but also the many people working in the weddings industry. I've met many people working in the industry, and last Thursday I held a meeting with people who worked in all sorts of trades. I learnt much, but also it was fascinating to hear that 400,000 jobs across the country are dependent on the wedding industry, bringing in an income of £14.7 billion. In addition, we have a large tourist trade in the wedding industry, which again attracts many couples to come to the UK to get married. So this is extensive for the economy as a whole, but also for people's livelihoods and jobs. What, in an industry which should bring so much joy at the moment is bringing so much hardship. The first 2 months of lockdown, people experienced the cancellation and postponement of weddings, so staff couldn't get furloughed. They had to work flat out to try and support couples during that time, and then of course moved into the harsh reality of not being able to access vital government support, the self-employed income support scheme, the grants we've heard about, the VAT, which many organisations haven't been able to access, and also business rates because many do not have direct premises, and therefore the hardship has been acute for many. And I heard from those working in the sector, predominantly women, I have to emphasise they'd saved up for their first home and therefore not able to access things like universal credit, and therefore are living off their savings now 8 months into the lockdown pandemic. They describe the future, though, as well, and that is where the government can really help, because the announcement made about the further lockdown and extending furlough to next March has brought a presumption that weddings won't be assuming in any time soon. And therefore, we need a comprehensive plan publishing around weddings so people can start making those plans. If I can give an example from one celebrant who had 48 weddings booked for this year. 2 went ahead as micro weddings, 36 moved into next year and are now being rearranged because people aren't confident, 1 into 2022 and 7 were lost. That is the scale of the impact of the cancellation of weddings, and many are deferring for the second or even third time, I heard. Therefore, we need to ensure that weddings are safe, socially distanced, and I would say to the Minister, if they can be certificated, that would be really helpful. Also, there's been a lack of evidence being brought forward as to suggest that these are places where there will be infection spread, and that was inference made by Public Health England. So it would be good to have the data from them if there has been any evidence of infection. But we need to ensure that there is testing, there is specific support that is brought forward. And those working in the wedding industry in my constituency asked for a scheme akin to the film and TV production restart scheme to help restart the wedding industry. Thank you.
McVeigh.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Gray. And now, unlike the member for Carshalton and Wallington, who delayed his wedding, I speak as someone who got married in September and experienced the nightmare of having to change plans and guests right up to the last minute. In fact, there was only 2 things that didn't change, Mr Gray, fortunately, and that was the date and the groom. So I do feel I have some understanding of how the wedding industry has suffered this year through lockdown, and it has been a particularly turbulent year, and one that was unnecessarily turbulent as rules brought in were not based on science and were arbitrary. So let me introduce you to David Erlin, a constituent of mine who understands only too well the arbitrary rules. He owns a restaurant, and he also has wedding venues too, King Street Kitchen in Knutsford and Colshaw Hall and Merrydale Manor in Tatton. And the stark differences. His restaurant is much smaller, and yet David could legally host up to 60 guests from 30 different households. And yet he couldn't in his wedding venues, much bigger with outside space, and it was capped at 15 guests. It also appears too that there was my constituent said that government really hadn't taken into account the measures that the wedding industry could put into place to be COVID compliant and the changes and the distress when rules were changed overnight. So venues like Arley Hall, a massive Jacobean hall with outside space, hundreds of acres, beautiful gardens, rules were changed overnight. They were allowed to hold the service, and then all their guests left and went to a pub up the road and were allowed to eat there. And yet they had got all the food, got all the staff, and could not have that ceremony take place. And Tatton and Cheshire is an area with a thriving wedding sector. The number of weddings held the year before, 4,500. That is down to 800. And the ones that are taking place are much, much smaller. And when, again, I speak to constituents who have wedding businesses, they say that they, on average, use a list of about 25 preferred local suppliers. All of those now do not have the income from those weddings. But it doesn't have to be that way. With some thought, some coherency, a roadmap to allow weddings to take place, COVID compliant, obviously, then this sector could once again re-emerge and allow weddings to take place. The oak tree in Pever, Jackie Mooney explained to me that she's had to postpone 90 weddings and cancel 30. Her income is less than 1/6 of what it was. And please note that her business insurance, which she paid a very high premium for the interruption of business, has not been assisted in any way. Also, Competition and Markets Authority guidance and insurance companies have pushed brides back to the wedding venue, saying, quote, frustrated contracts and insist your full refunds. Now, they've helped brides and grooms in any which way they have. They've postponed once, they've postponed twice for people, but it is a logistical nightmare. And these are her words. She says, I dread things now if things don't turn round, because I can't sleep of a night. I'm not eating because of all the things I've got to do and the money I pay back. This is true of the business at Style Lodge Wedding too. And I will end on one note, which is from Colshall Hall and the Merridale Manor, David Earlham. He says, I would happily be a guinea pig for the minister. I will do a business venue that is COVID compliant. I will do track and trace. I will make sure people are served at the table. I will make sure we do absolutely everything that is COVID compliant. Please look at the rules we have put in place. Please have a Zoom with this person and the rest of the people in my patch so that we can go back to having weddings and true, once in a lifetime, for most people, celebrations.
Justin Mellors.
See you in the chair, and the emphasis on business grants for those businesses with premises is probably one of the factors that led to many people in the sectors that we're debating today being denied financial support, whilst the fact that a lot of them are also freelancers or self-employed is another factor. Yet we see many of those who were excluded from support the first time round have been excluded once again. Maybe the government could have been given a little latitude the first time for not covering everyone, given the speed at which events came to them. But now, 8 months on, and with the benefit of that experience, there's absolutely no excuse for anyone to have been left behind this time. We need a commitment from government that this will be looked into urgently, because by the time the current scheme comes to an end, some people will have been trading for nearly 2 years and won't have been entitled to a penny. How can that be allowed to happen? I hope the government will listen and offer a roadmap for the wedding and live events industries with sector-specific support for this intervening time period until we get back to some sense of normality, because telling them to find another job, frankly, is a cop-out. And like many members, I'll move on to weddings, because I've been contacted by many constituents who have had to cancel or rearrange their wedding day. They've seen numbers restricted and then restricted some more. The limit of 30 to a wedding lasted for just 2 weeks before it was reduced to 15. Now, either that means there was a specific piece of evidence that said the time limit needed to be reduced for weddings, but not funerals, that emerged during that fortnight, or the limit should never have been 30 in the first place. Neither of those alternatives engenders much confidence that the government is on top of things. How can it be that a judgment was formed to change the numbers back down to 15 in just a fortnight? By applying restrictions of 30 or 15 to weddings, many consider the wedding industry to be closed in all but name. And by including outside suppliers in that number, couples have been placed in the invidious position of having to choose whether their photographer or their granny attends. I don't think that's right at all. The wedding industry did not get benefit over the summer from the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, despite many venues being able to hold significantly more guests in a COVID-secure way than restaurants. Instead, we saw the sector largely ignored, despite how much it is worth to the economy and how much it benefits people in other associated industries such as hair and beauty and photographers and so on. And an important question I've received from my constituents who have seen their wedding days restricted or cancelled is why they could go and sit in a restaurant with over 100 people, socially distant at separate tables, yet they could only have 15 people attend a wedding venue that could safely hold 10 times that amount. I have to agree with them. On the face of it, it seems illogical. And given the massive financial impact these decisions have made, I would hope there is strong evidence behind that distinction being made. So I look forward to the Minister providing a response, because he will know how vital it is to keep public support for these measures, to ensure that they're evidence-based, they're logical and they're clearly explained.
Thank you and congratulate colleagues. We're doing well, and therefore the remaining people probably about 4 minutes they want to. Karen Bradley.
I do hope that the fact that I chair a committee you sit on is not has somehow swayed you into giving me a longer time than other people. I will remember this when we meet on Wednesday. But thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I also pay tribute to my honourable friend from Carshalton and Wallington for his excellent opening speech and setting the scene so well. Now, given that I only have 4 minutes, I will focus on just one issue, which is the issue of wedding venues. And like many of us, I have been contacted by so many people who have been affected, couples whose big day has not happened or has been seriously scaled down, and those businesses that supply wedding venues. But I want to focus on just 2 of the venues in my constituency that are unique venues, Heaton House Farm and the Ashes. Now, Heaton House Farm is in Rushton Spencer and the Ashes is in Endon, both in Staffordshire Moorlands. They are bespoke wedding venues. They don't do anything else. They offer large events. They are licensed to do venues. They have the most incredible scenery. You may, if you've been lucky enough, Mr. Gray, to sit in the Hairdressers and read Hello magazine or OK magazine, have seen these venues because they host celebrity weddings that feature in these great august publications. But they simply have no business at all at the moment. They really have nothing. They couldn't benefit, as the honourable gentleman from Ellesmere Port said, from Eat Out to Help Out, because they don't offer food outside of weddings and large events. They can't benefit from the VAT reduction because they've got no turnover. They're not making any money at the moment. Like my right honourable friend from Tatton, the Heaton House Farm team have taken over running a community pub in Rushton Spencer, the Royal Oak, just to find somewhere to employ their staff. Because without that, they will lose their staff, and they are not making a single penny on this. They are doing this in order that they can keep their staff and make sure that when we can get back to having weddings, they can do so in the best way they possibly can. They don't benefit from many of the grants because their rateable values are too high, and they simply just need to be able to get back to holding weddings. As my right honourable friend said, they can hold a wedding, they can hold the service, but they can't sit the guests before the regulations change to move it down to 15. And yet, those guests could go to the local pub and sit up to 60 of them in tables of 6, socially distanced. This cannot be right. We have to find a way through this. So could I please invite the Minister? Would he meet my constituents from Heaton House Farm and the Ashes to discuss this issue and see what support the government can find to help these incredibly special places?
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. Now, live events are obviously very important across North East Fife, and although nightclubs are thin on the ground, unlike Newcastle upon Tyne North, North East Fife is the home of golf, and we do look forward to welcoming the Open back to St Andrews in 2022 for its 150th occasion. But I do want to limit my remarks to weddings because, as many members have already said, I have also been contacted by a number of venues, and it is a key contributor to the local economy. Kinkelbrae is a wedding and events venue that's been operating in its old farmsteading as a venue since 2003 and normally holds about 80 events a year, the majority of which are weddings. They're a small business with 2 full-time staff and 3 part-time, but they contribute substantially to the local economy because for every wedding, not only does it mean revenue for Kinkelbrae, it means revenue for their huge range of local suppliers, from photography to music to catering. It means 100 guests staying in North East Fife for 2 or 3 days, each of them spending in other locations on food and accommodation. But Samantha from Kinkelbrae told me this: the coronavirus pandemic has made it impossible for us to operate in any capacity. Our revenue has been reduced to virtually zero, while costs still need to be paid to keep the business afloat for the upkeep of old buildings, wages, insurance, marketing and professional services. And we have tried to launch new ventures such as farmers' markets and beer gardens, but have been prevented from going ahead by environmental health locally. And she did tell me that the government support so far has been amazing, and I recognise that support too. But she also says, under the current guidelines, we cannot operate or generate any revenue, and the business will not survive much longer. We have the space and capacity to do events safely, but with larger numbers than the current guidelines permit. The limit should be linked to the capacity of the venue. Now, obviously, guidelines are different in Scotland, where there is a maximum cap currently of 20 guests. But when England comes out of lockdown, there will likely be a similar cap. And to get through this pandemic, the Government and the Scottish Government have had to take on a great swathe of extra powers, but we need to ensure that they are being exercised in the best way possible. It's not just King Kobe buyer that's affected, as I said. It's the hotels and bed and breakfast where the guests stay and the suppliers that I mentioned earlier. And I just want to mention one supplier, which is Amy, a small business owner whose florist's business is largely focused on flowers for weddings. She moved to online only, giving up her shop, but remains hugely impacted by the restrictions. And people are moving their weddings to next year or even to 2022, and she's losing business as a result. She is also saying change the restrictions, make them more sensitive to venue size, and that surely is a way forward alongside comprehensive testing, tracing and isolating. But I do want to mention that she did highlight to me, to make matters worse, there is the looming threat of a no-deal Brexit, which would mean an 8% tariff on imported flowers, and there is simply not enough supply of flowers in the UK to meet this demand. If the Government doesn't agree a trade deal, that really will push her business over the edge. So I believe that the Government won't change the restrictions, or can't. It needs to provide further financial support to enable these businesses to survive through until March. The furlough has been extended, yes, but for a business like Samantha's, wages are a pretty minor cost in the scheme of things. Business grants were available over 6 months ago and are unlikely to have lasted in bank accounts until now. North East Fife would be nothing without these businesses. We often hear that small, locally owned businesses are the backbone of the local economy. But in North East Fife, they are the face of that economy too. They are what you encounter when you travel throughout the kingdom. Thank you.
Maria Miller.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I commend my honourable friend for securing this debate today and really urge the Minister to look at these petitions in detail. And whilst I might be able to speak for at length about the issues facing live music, whether it's in my own constituency at places like the Anvil and indeed the many festivals I seem to go to occasionally to pick my children up, I'm going to focus my comments today, Mr Gray, on the particular issues of weddings, because I've been struck by the way in which the restrictions the government has absolutely had to bring in have really gone to the core of people's lives, whether it's the couples who have had to postpone what might have been an event that they planned for, not just for months, but for years, but also the wide range of businesses that have been fundamentally undermined by the measures that have come into place. And I hear Mr Gray focus on the correspondence I've had from organisations like the Barn at Avington, near my constituency, a wedding venue, Balloons for You and Events for You, fundamentally affected by the restrictions brought in around weddings and other events. Sophie Design Bridal, which produces bridal wear, that is their main focus, and without weddings, they've lost one of their main business lines. And DJs like Aaron Perkis and Gary Job, who've written to me about the way in which their livelihoods have been fundamentally affected by what has gone on in the last 6 to 9 months. And all have written about the paralysis that has gone into an important part of their income, the wedding industry, and the devastating impact on their livelihoods. What they need now more than ever, Mr Gray, is some certainty for the future. Now, I know that the Minister cannot stand here today and give us a cast iron guarantee when things are going to change, but he can give us some certainty about the way in which the government is going to move to a position where we start to live with this virus rather than completely shut things down. We've heard today about the way in which we could change the rules around the capacity of venues to help weddings go ahead on a slightly larger scale. And there are many other things that the Minister could be doing to prepare a roadmap for the future so that people can start planning their big day yet again, and these businesses can see light at the end of the tunnel. Of course I will.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. She's making a really compelling and powerful speech, and it resonates very much with the representations I've had from constituents. And Does she also agree that one of the big challenges that people face is the limbo that they have been left in, not able to plan for the wedding they dreamed of, nor even for a wedding that they could compromise on, and not knowing whether the insurance will cover the losses of everything that they've spent? And that's why the government needs so much to give that certainty, at least as what's happening, to end the limbo for these couples.
Maria Miller.
And my honourable friend makes a very valid point, which I'm sure the Minister will want to respond to in detail. In closing, Mr Gray, I will just say that I'd like to commend Natasha Newland, the founder of the County Wedding Club, for speaking up so eloquently in my area for this sector, which directly and indirectly employs so many people, not just in my area, but throughout the country.
Ian Hunt.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Gray. Thank you very much. May I first thank the petitioners, as well as my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, and of course the 394 people in my constituency who, as of this morning, had signed the petitions. Live events, conferences and exhibitions organisers, events such as graduation balls, all have been affected in this virus. I think both petitions are very important, but I'd like to focus my speech on the one calling for an increased number of guests to be permitted at weddings according to venue capacity, as this has been the issue I've had most contact with directly. One such conversation has been with Mr Henry Weldon, the Managing Director of Maverick Events, operating at Prestwold Hall, a beautiful and popular Grade 1 listed stately home in the heart of the Leicestershire Wolds. Mr Weldon has explained to me that, to date, he has seen over 120 weddings and events rearranged or cancelled. Both his catering business and the venue combined have lost a turnover of £1 million in 2020 alone. He says, there are serious concerns about not being able to restart by spring 2021, by which time we will effectively have been closed for a year. Government must give support and confidence to our sector, and hence to our couples who have also suffered greatly. As I said in my speech during the debate on the health protection regulations last week, we must use these next few weeks to plan for how we can create recovery for ourselves, our local communities and our businesses. As part of this, I strongly believe that we should be taking a different approach to events when the new restrictions have eased. Risk assessment is the key to this, and I have had a number of conversations with ministers over the past few months about adopting Northern Ireland's approach to weddings, in that venues produce their own risk assessment of how many people they can safely accommodate, whilst adhering to social distancing guidelines. Of course, we should not limit this approach to just weddings, but we should also look at extending it to conferences and music events, which have been in some of the hardest hit industries. Over the summer, we saw how it was possible to restart industries in a safe way. We allowed restaurants, hairdressers and leisure centres, to name a few, reopen, as long as they followed the Covid-19 secure guidance. So why should these events be any different? We cannot continue to restrict events indefinitely. We need a plan, as we have been implemented for other industries, so that events can restart, and I believe that the more nuanced approach taken by Northern Ireland could form the basis of this. I've had a number of constituents write to me expressing their sadness and anxiety about having to delay their wedding or make difficult decisions about which of the people closest to them cannot attend. As one constituent has said, I recognise the impact of Covid-19 on everyone's daily lives, but for those couples who are planning a wedding, the toll on our mental health is significant. A wedding takes years to plan. It has an impact on finances, and postponing a wedding for a full year means there is a huge risk that immediate family members may not be around to see our big day, which is heartbreaking for us and for them. All I ask is that consideration be given, that numbers are increased according to venue capacity. I feel that the hospitality industry has adapted in the wake of Covid-19 and shows that there are ways to hold a wedding and be safe. I would like to echo my constituents' plea, and I hope that the government takes the next few weeks to give serious consideration to reforming these approach to the events.
Edward Timson.
Thank you very much, Mr Graham. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. Devolved Hall, Peckforton Castle, Cumbermere Abbey, Carden Park, Wrenbury Hall, just some of the stunning, romantic-laden fairy tale wedding venues in Edinburgh that are at the forefront of a thriving £10 billion+ industry, employing, as we've heard, over 400,000 people through around 120,000 viable and mainly family-run businesses across the country. And I say thriving, but of course since March, this sizable chunk of our economy, which for all intents and purposes has been shut down. And whilst it's important to recognise the Chancellor's significant financial support package has rescued many from failure and kept businesses, including in the wedding industry, on life support, since I spoke in the House in July and again in September in support of more targeted support for them, the situation has, I'm afraid, only got worse. Indeed, the reduction of allowed numbers to 15 on the 22nd of September saw 15 to 20,000 weddings cancelled and a loss of a further £450 to £600 million in revenues. And if I look specifically at the boutique hotel group based in my constituency, in 2020 to date, they've had 432 weddings cancelled. They've lost £7.8 million in sales and £3.7 million in net income. And Dorford Hall near Nantwich has only been able to hold 4 weddings this summer, with the business closed for the greater part of this year. And whilst the rest of the hospitality sector benefited from the VAT relief and the Eat Out to Help Out, wedding venues were in effect excluded. And this also has, as we've heard too, serious consequences for nearly all businesses in and around their supply chain. The Managing Director, Chris Naylor of the boutique hotel group, told me that one of their suppliers, a florist, who would usually turn over in excess of £200,000 from his venues alone, spread over 40 weddings a year, has only done 1 wedding. And their recommended DJ and lighting, who turns over £350,000 from their venues, has received no turnover since March. And their photographer, who would normally bring in around £1 million through 450 plus weddings at £2,000 per wedding, has not seen that sales coming in. And these are photographers who are based across the northwest area. So there is significant hardship that is being caused right across the wedding industry. Now, we've heard a lot about this roadmap, but I think it's time that we actually saw it come into reality. Something which builds from socially distanced numbers towards normal weddings, where situation and technologies allow, and the wedding industry and the venues themselves are really well set up for that to take place. We can put them at the heart of the test and trace, and we can also make sure that they have all the support they need financially so that their cash flow can continue through what continues to be a difficult time. Because January and February next year, it's the most important months to sell the 2022 weddings, and that will also help with those cash flow issues. We saw in the debate just before this, Mr Gray, that with spectators going to venues to watch elite sport, there's a task force that's been set up to try and work that towards happening as soon as possible. We need a similar group for the wedding industry, and I'd urge the Minister to do what he can to work with all of those who have a keen and now urgent interest in making this become a reality, because there is hope. There is a lot of latent capacity within the wedding industry, a real chance to bounce back from what has been its worst ever year. And there is an incentive for the government to do this too, with the tax receipts that will flow as a consequence. So I would ask the Minister to continue to work closely with the wedding industry to ensure that we don't miss this chance to bring back what is a really great part of our economy.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr Gray. And I would like to also start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for opening this debate with such a good speech. A debate which deals with 2 very important issues, both nationally and for my constituency of Clwyd South, where 105 of my constituents signed the E-petition calling for additional support for live events, and 91 signed calling for an increase in the number of guests permitted at weddings, according to venue capacity. Over the last few months, I've organised regular roundtable Zoom calls with representatives of the wedding industry in Clwyd South, such as Phil Godsall of Iscoyd Park, Andrew Marshall of Tower Hill Barns, and Tracy Owen of Tyndall Hall, and with others from further afield in Wales. These meetings have been joined at different times by ministers, including the Secretary of State for Wales, the Welsh Office Minister, and the Minister for Economy of the Welsh Government. And in a constituency like mine, and I suspect many other members here, with many rural communities, these venues are of particular importance for the local economy and jobs. Now, I appreciate that this is a devolved matter in Wales, but the key issues that these Welsh venues have highlighted are similar to those in England, and I think can be summarised in 5 brief points. The limit on numbers, whether it be 15 or 30, is arbitrary and should be related to the size of the venue. The limit is out of kilter with European venues, where the figure is often significantly higher, up to 100. The venues I talk to say that in the majority of cases, 50 guests is an economic number, and that it is difficult to break even with lower numbers. Weddings are, with all due respect to everybody in the health industry, not super spreaders of the virus, as all the guests are known to the bride and groom and therefore are easier to control in terms of track and trace by the venue. Also, there is a very strong vested interest among the guests, for whom there are no random guests, to look after each other health-wise. It's been much more difficult in practice for wedding venues to access financial support than other hospitality businesses, partly because they have been able to stay open in Wales unless there is a national lockdown. But this goes back to the limit on guests, where staying open for 15 or 30 guests simply is not economic for a wedding venue. Now, people book weddings up to 18 months in advance, and therefore the industry is particularly badly hit by the lack of visibility going forward. And it's not an industry that can stop and start like some other hospitality businesses. Now, I fully appreciate that the Minister and the governments here at Westminster and Cardiff, as I've seen with the roundtable discussions that I've organised, are listening and take the matter seriously, and there's plenty of economic support that has come forward. But I think, as many as have said this afternoon, it's not targeted in the way that it needs to be. And one of the practical suggestions I would have is that, given that a lot of these venues are suffering from the withdrawal of clients' deposits, and this is getting a very, very serious problem now, I would have thought that a practical solution would be the underwriting or financial furloughing of these deposits. This would bring stability and a breathing space so that the wedding venues can plan with greater confidence for the future.
Thank you, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I pass my congratulations to the petitioners, and a double congratulation indeed to the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington, both on securing the debate and his recent nuptials as well. We've heard from members around the chamber today with some very similar issues. We heard from the member from Salford and Eccles talking about the plight of the excluded, which is something I want to return to shortly, and talking about the rich musical and artistic heritage, which is something I think we have in common across many constituencies, no least my own. The Honourable Member for Solihull talked about the incompatibility of tackling COVID with the operation of these venues. And the Honourable Member for Newcastle upon Tyne talked quite correctly about the loss of character from the loss of some of these businesses. We've also heard from the Honourable Member from Tatton, and again, my congratulations over your recent wedding, and from others such as the Honourable Member for Staffordshire Moorlands, and talked about the enormous effort for businesses to keep staff on who didn't qualify for support. The Honourable Member for North East Fife talked about the supply chain impact and the impact on the local economy, the very direct impact. And again, that's something I have in common in terms of my own constituency. The Honourable Members for Loughborough, Edinburgh and Clwyd South talked about the need for more business support, more targeted support, and of course in the difficulties for businesses accessing that support as well. Very many common themes that we can talk about in this chamber today. This is indeed a really tough time for the wedding and the nighttime economy industry. There are arguments, of course, for exceptions, which we have heard, but most people, I think, understand that the restriction measures are sensible and necessary, and I think the majority of people understand their need. That doesn't, however, make it any easier for those couples who've spent months, often even years, planning their perfect day. They've been dealt a really tough blow by Covid-19. The uncertainty meaning that they've had to take the heart-wrenching decision to either cancel or go ahead with their their marriages without many of their loved ones present to share the day with them. A wedding is an important milestone in people's lives, and it's with this in mind that the Scottish Government are trying to strike the right balance between having a policy that empathises while putting the safety of our communities first. And to clarify, in Scotland, the current rules are in levels 1, 2 or 3, no more than 20 people should attend, and in level 4, no more than 15. If we get, and I hope we will, to get some regions would leave level 0 in future, then they would have a more recognisable number of 50 allowed in the venue. But we know that mixing at weddings is, mixing at any large-scale party, a risk it causes a risk of further transmission of the disease, and it must be carefully monitored to make sure that doesn't happen. But the impact that's felt isn't just emotional, it's also financial, as we've heard around this chamber. In Scotland, the average cost of a wedding is £20,000, and therefore the knock-on impact on suppliers serving this industry is dramatic, heightened by the fact that Scotland is a popular wedding destination. An average of 29,000 wedding ceremonies every year since 2001. Over 130,000 couples who live elsewhere have chosen Scotland as their destination for their wedding, and we're grateful for them for sharing it with us. Behind those numbers are tens of thousands of wedding supply businesses, now struggling to make ends meet because of this pandemic. The hospitality and wedding venue sector is worth £963 million for freelance or self-employed photographers, DJs, musicians, wedding planners and suppliers of wedding-themed products. This is a big, big deal. Many of these freelancers are self-employed people and are part of the 3 million who've been excluded from support, in spite of countless calls from me, from my colleagues in the SNP, from colleagues across the chamber in this House, asking for them to be remembered and not forgiven by the Chancellor, asking them to act, but unfortunately they continue to be ignored. The Minister must today answer on what he's going to do about this. All businesses in this sector deserve to be allowed to keep their businesses afloat during this crisis, so that these completely viable, outside normal times, these completely viable businesses that would be thriving can move on and be there for us to support the economy once we've emerged from this emergency. The coming months are critical, so I ask once again for the Minister to urge the Chancellor to give these businesses a fighting chance. Topping up bounce-back loans is not the answer. Leading to crippling toxic debt for companies isn't the answer to get them out of this. The government should now be looking to convert these loans to grants for these businesses. As I've said, there's widespread recognition that the restrictions are required to help fight this pernicious virus, but we need to get to the point where we can ensure these businesses, these jobs are still there when we emerge. Wedding venues, nightclubs and music venues have seen their business decimated. In Scotland, despite having one hand tied behind our backs, we've gone beyond the Barnett consequentials. The Scottish Government has spent nearly £4 billion tackling Covid-19, £2.3 billion of that on business support, including almost £900 million of non-domestic rate relief, a £1.3 billion business grant scheme, £30 million creative tourism and hospitality enterprise hardship fund, and a £185 million package of targeted support for SMEs and the self-employed, which dominate the nighttime business sector. The UK Government must now live up to the £350 billion promise. It's not working in loans for firms that are struggling, especially this winter. They should ramp up the support in England. It's the right thing to do for businesses in England, and allow us to use the consequentials to support these businesses in Scotland. And once again, the Chancellor must act to make things right for the excluded who've been battered, bruised and brushed off. They are even worried about the £20 a week universal credit uplift being removed shortly. So we need to see a guarantee on that too. There should be provision for furlough beyond March in the sector. It's clear that the big talk of whatever it takes from the Chancellor, that's not what is being delivered. That's not what people are saying. The financial powers should be devolved simple changes to the borrowing rules should be made to allow the Scottish Government to step in where the UK Government is not. We've been begging for this for months and months. The failure of this Tory UK Government to listen to the needs of the Scottish people is not new. But boy, is it being recognised in Scotland just now and amplified throughout this Brexit debacle and now onto this crisis. It's no wonder that polls are now showing that people in Scotland want a new referendum, and a majority of people in 11 consecutive polls now see that independence is the way for us to make the right choices for our future.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm getting used to following the honourable gentleman and preceding the other honourable gentleman today, and I often agree with much of what my honourable friend says, apart from his last paragraph. Nearly always I disagree with in these debates. But we're today discussing two very important petitions, and I think you can see, Mr Chair, from the number of members here that these are really attracting quite a lot of attention, and I pay tribute to the member for Carshalton and Wallington for his excellent opening speech and for proposing these petitions today. The first of which is the Let Us Dance petition created by Jasper Levine, and as somebody, I must confess, who was often found in the Hacienda nightclub in her youth and is a regular attender at the Glastonbury Festival. I'm particularly pleased to speak in this debate, but it was no surprise to me, therefore, that there were more signatories from my constituency in this debate than most other constituencies across the country. And just at this point, I do want to thank Sasha Lord, who's the nighttime economy spokesperson for Greater Manchester, who I think has been great in advocating these issues for those from this industry from outside of Greater Manchester as well. And the second petition on the number of guests permitted at weddings that we've heard a lot about. And I think the arguments made today and the number of members that have spoken on these issues are compelling, and I hope that ministers will listen to these as they make them. As we've heard, these sectors were a thriving and deeply interconnected ecosystem supporting millions of jobs across the country. I've held a number of Zoom roundtables with representatives from these shutdown sectors and those sectors closed in all but name. And many of the problems that we're discussing today also affect the conferences and exhibition sector, which we've heard a little bit about, as well as big sporting events. And together, all of these sectors make up a large proportion of the visitor and hospitality economy of our towns and cities. These sectors are at the centre of a wider ecology of jobs and employment, from makeup artists to florists, to hairdressers, music technicians, security guards, and many, many others. They contribute to our thriving town centres, the hotel industry, hospitality, taxi drivers, and many more, not to mention the huge supply chain, which we've heard much about. And the majority of these businesses are not just viable, they are world-leading enterprises, generating and contributing billions of pounds to our economy. As we've heard, the wedding industries generated £15 billion in the previous year, the nighttime economy over £66 billion, and the conferences and events businesses billions more, as well as all the important trade deals that are made at these business events. And since the first lockdown, the financial impact on these sectors has been alarming. I heard today in a roundtable I was holding with those from Greater Manchester that the nighttime economy is down 90% since the beginning of this pandemic. Tens of thousands of weddings have been cancelled. Not my friend, the member for Tatton, she managed to have her wedding, and congratulations to her. But the wedding sector is not a sector officially closed. They're closed in all but name. Their trade has essentially stopped, but they've not actually been officially closed. And this is having an impact. And what's come with the waves and the changes and the inconsistencies is the successive waves of restarts and refunds having to be played out. There are many sole traders, SMEs, supply chains, freelancers who've lost work, as we have heard, and the chopping and changing has really now taken its toll. And as we've heard, Bookings are made way far in advance, and the uncertainty around this sector could now be the final death knell for the weddings industry. But even before the second national lockdown that we're now in, it was clear that these industries needed more support. And whilst the reintroduction of the furlough scheme is welcome, it will have come far too late for too many. Those I've spoken to on the many Zoom calls I've held took decisions on redundancies weeks ago. And let's remember that without the businesses to administer the furlough schemes, the jobs won't be saved either. And what we're now seeing is businesses starting to go bust, unable to pay the overheads that their businesses incur, the rents, the venue hire, the utilities, the equipment and so on. The first wave of cash grants haven't reached most in the events and weddings industry. They didn't qualify, let alone the supply chain. And the second wave of cash grants won't help most either. Even though the government now seems to accept the principle of supporting businesses through the continued restrictions, in practice they are falling well short. For example, nightclubs and live events can only get a grant qualifying from the 1st of November, despite being closed since March. Big conference events won't get anything at all. And weddings will have to rely on the discretionary pots, which are seriously insufficient and will leave a postcode lottery. We should also remember that many businesses and self-employed workers in these sectors have been unable to receive any support at all, as we have heard, because they are from the 3 million excluded. They're sole traders, they're self-employed, excluded, and there are many company directors who receive all of their income through dividend payments. So we need some proper sectoral support, as we've heard. I think we've heard some good ideas on that today. Proper discretionary grants, action on rents, action on the 3 million excluded, ideas on rates relief for the next year and beyond. But as we've heard already today, what most businesses tell me, and I'm sure they say this to the Minister too, is that they want a route map out of closure. This is now the critical business issue, because most businesses want to trade. That's their job, that's what they do. So we do urgently now need a real plan, a route map out for this sector. Mass testing, test, track and trace and isolate, and a vaccine. These would all make a difference. But in the interim, these sectors need sensible guidance on how they can operate safely. And I think we've heard some the member for Edinburgh and others some really good ideas around bringing those ideas together, because they want that level playing field. As we've heard in this debate today, why is it that a restaurant can have 60 people from different households operating, but a wedding venue cannot? It just doesn't make sense. Or people can get in close quarters on an aeroplane, but they can't come together for a family celebration. There are a number of other fixes too, and I would urge the Minister to bring the industry together, because they're creative, expert people. And let's not remember, they are used to managing events. That's what they do. So they know the people in the room and they can manage it well. So I would urge the Minister, because these are viable businesses. They are not, like some other parts of our economy, going through some structural change. They were massively growing before this pandemic. And let's be honest, the minute that we're allowed to celebrate and party with our families again, we will be doing so. There will be huge demand for events and weddings. So I hope the Minister has heard the calls today and that we can get this sector rolling again and we can all have a party.
Paul Scully.
Thank you very much, Mr Gray, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I first of all thank the member for Carshalton and Wallington for leading this important debate on the two petitions. I am so looking forward to attending his wedding with Jed, his partner, when it's possible to do it. It's been postponed once. I'm really hoping you don't have to postpone it a second time. But before addressing the specific concerns highlighted in this debate, I just want to talk about the two issues at hand. Firstly, wedding receptions. I want to put on record that both myself and officials in Bays have received a number of representations for the wedding industry over the summer. It's pleasing to see the dedication of the member for my honourable friend from Clwyd South, who's, as a number of people have done, has brought together the industry and listened to the sector and reflected on their views and been working tirelessly for their sectors that are so hard-pressed and unable to open fully and in some cases at all. I saw the call list for this afternoon's session, Mr Gray, and when I saw my honourable friends from Edinburgh and Loughborough, I knew that they would be here because they've been tireless in catching me every time they can in the voting lobby to reflect their constituents, and that's absolutely right. That shows the dedication that they have for this important sector. But when I've spoken to I've had the representations from many people in the wedding industry, but also spoken to many of them in various roundtables as well, because it's so important to actually listen and reflect on the roadmap, the considerations that have been outlined today. But it's important too just to have the context of this. We're keenly aware of the importance of weddings for many people in the country and how the plans have been affected by the coronavirus outbreak. We indeed heard my right honourable friend from Tatton about her ceremony, which may be curtailed in number, but I'm sure it wasn't curtailed in any way in the fun, the enjoyment and the love that they have for each other in their celebrations. But it's also the family, the friends, the guests, and as we've also heard, the small businesses that service and work with the venues and the planners to celebrate people's weddings. And that's pivotal to so many people's wives. So we did publish guidance on how wedding celebrations could take place in England in a manner that was Covid-19 secure and in line with social distance guidelines. And the significance of these events were underscored by the fact that we enabled the celebrations to take place initially with 30 people present, but regrettably that clearly had to be lowered to 15 subsequently. That included the couple, the witnesses and the guests, but it didn't include suppliers or venue staff working at the wedding venue. Now, clearly I know that's nowhere near enough for the sector and the viability of the sector. And the Right Honourable Member for Inverness, we've had discussions about viability in the past, and I very much take on board the fact that come the day when we are learning to live with the virus and we can have rapid testing, we can have the results of the good news today, hopefully, of one particular vaccine avenue, that we can have these businesses, these cross fingers indeed, switch on almost overnight, because the dates are there, the businesses are there, and they are viable when we get out of this situation. I'll give away briefly, but I do want to just make progress.
Just on the point of weddings, I think it's important to acknowledge that a huge number of couples have actually not booked their weddings, and they aren't waiting ready to go because they've lost their date. They had a July, they've now been offered a January, probably at the same price with no discount. It's really heartbreaking for many of these couples, and I totally recognise the optimism of the Minister, but he should also recognise the sheer heartache that many couples are living with today.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady, and she's absolutely right. I see this on my Twitter feed, my Instagram feed, and a number of things, which is the pain and the heartbreak of couples who are looking forward to that very special day. And we've heard some situations as well about the financial costs, the deposits, and those difficulties that people have had as well. But the initial moves, the conversations that we've had, I think does illustrate the importance that we attach to these life-affirming events. But there's a fundamental difference. We've talked. Some people have talked about the restaurants and the difference between numbers of restaurants and in wedding venues. But by very nature of a wedding, but bringing families and friends together from across the country and potentially from around the world, these events are particularly vulnerable to the spread of Covid-19. Now, I don't want to say, because I know that it's not the case, that hospitality, despite the coverage in some of the media, that hospitality, pubs, restaurants have worked so hard to become Covid-19 secure that they are some of the safest places in the country to actually be. But in wedding sectors, in the wedding sector, we do also have to realise that as much as I know, having spoken to venue owners and organisers, that spending extended periods of time together, and it becomes harder to resist breaking social distancing at a family event, unlike a visit to a public house or restaurant where groups are more isolated. So we want to continue to work with those professionals to make sure that we can bring them together with Public Health England and other health professionals to have that sense of surety that we can manage that social distancing throughout an entire wedding process. I had a conversation just today with Richard Eagleton of McQueen's Flowers and Sarah Hayward of Sarah Hayward Weddings and Celebrations, who are seeking to build a task force, the very kind of task force that my honourable friend, member for Edinburgh, talked about, which I'm happy to work with really closely and have a two-way dialogue with them and their colleagues from the sector, both the professionals that supply the sector, that service the sector, as well as the planners and the venue holders themselves, because then we can have that direct contact, that direct conversation that I hope will lead to the kind of planning that the members have been talking about, the suggestions they've been talking about. I'll happily give away briefly.
I asked specifically if the Minister would look into the pilot scheme that one of my constituents has put in place. Would he look into that and have a Zoom meeting with my constituents?
Minister.
I'll happily look into any pilot scheme that's been going around. It's something that I think, as I say, maybe we can feed in with this task force, with officials, with health officials, in order to look at how we might be able to bring weddings on stream as and when the health advice allows. I'm clearly not an epidemiologist myself, but it becomes more than that. It becomes behavioural science and as well as the economics, which is very much part of my department and my role. But turning to live events, oh yes, actually no, I should have answered your question, but please. Yes.
I'd just be very grateful if he could reflect on just where siblings and parents are terminally ill. If it was only for 5 people, would you consider that?
Minister. Thank you, Honourable Friend, and I will cover that actually in a second. I just do want to turn to live events first. In tandem with our discussions with the wedding industry, we're committed to continue to work with the musical and cultural sectors to understand the difficulties they face and help them access support through the challenging times. Ministers in Department of Culture, Media and Sport have been in discussion with stakeholders across the creative and cultural sector, and that's included the development of draft planning guidance for how music festivals may be able to take place in the future. Significant funds have been allocated via the Cultural Recovery Fund to protect cultural organisations across England, almost a fifth of which has gone to the music sector. And more generally, the Chancellor recently announced the continuation of the coronavirus job retention scheme known as the furlough scheme. That means that workers in any part of the UK can retain their job, even if their employer can't afford to pay them, and be paid at least 80% of their salary at up to £2,500 a month. The flexibility of the current furlough scheme will be retained to allow employees to continue to work where they can. I'll happily give way.
Bradley.
I have rushed back to the horseshoe. On the point of the nighttime economy and flexibility, will he also consider, when we're through this lockdown, allowing drinking up times after 10 o'clock so that venues can make sure that they can do 2 sittings for meals, and also we don't have everybody leaving the venue at the same time?
Minister.
The Right Honourable Lady says something that I've been working on for some time now. Having seen it myself, having worked with the hospitality sector, I have regular weekly conversations with the hospitality sector. I've spoken to the nightclub sector on a few occasions as well, which I'll come to in a second. But some people have mentioned Northern Ireland, actually that's one example where they've had a separated system and different system in weddings. The frustrating thing for me when I'm trying to work with health professionals and the hospitality sector is that the incidence of transmission is so high in Northern Ireland at the moment, which is not, I'm not suggesting that in any way, shape or form that's connected to the hospitality sector, but it just does become very difficult to disaggregate the data and to then work through the evidence with health professionals. But I'll continue to certainly to do so. But in terms of going back to event sector, we've been working as well that businesses will be protected from the threat of eviction until the end of the year. So we've extended the moratorium on for commercial tenants as well, which I think is incredibly important. Let me turn very quickly to nightclubs and music venues. Music venues create, present or support many different genres of music, and they've been eligible to apply for funds from the £1.57 billion support package for key cultural organisations to help them through the pandemic. As part of the Cultural Recovery Fund, some festivals, dance venues and nightclubs received grants, which included the Ministry of Sound and the Made Festival. £3.36 million has been shared amongst 136 venues across England who applied for the Emergency Grassroots Music Venues Fund. and that's supported grassroots venues to survive the imminent risk of collapse. But I do know how this is an ongoing situation. I've spoken to a number of nightclub operators, including Deltic and Fabric and Stonegate pubs, who own nightclub venues as well. I've spoken to Mike Hill from the Nighttime Industries Association, who has been mentioned a couple of times, and indeed Sasha Lord, who the Honourable Lady of Manchester Central talked about, who has been particularly proactive and very constructive in his discussions, and I welcome further discussions with him. But the Honourable member talked about deathbed weddings. Just want to cover that, because the deathbed, the idea of allowing civil partnerships, weddings where one of the people getting married is seriously ill and not expected to recover. It's limited to 6 people, and it's a national guidance there. So it should not be that local authorities are taking the time to enforce that in any different way, apart from that specific thing. But I will take his point across. It's not my particular department, but the extended families that he referred to. I will certainly take that away and reflect that to the minister, whose direct responsibility is there. The Honourable Lady for Newcastle upon Tyne North, who I served on the Petition Committee for many years, so this is, I'm getting used to being this side of the desk now rather than the other side, starting the thing. She talked about the venues in Newcastle and what happens if they disappear and the cultural void that appears. I'm also the Minister for London, so I only know too well. I've talked about the Gotham City scenario in London. The fact is, if you have the ultra-rich who are insulated from everything, and you have the poorer people, the people on low incomes, that have to be forced into the city centres to service those areas, but you hollow out the culture, the mass people that are coming in spending, and it really does create a very, very different city scenario. We will be so much poorer if we get rid of our culture as a result of this pandemic. So we absolutely must work as hard as we can to avoid the sobering statistics that my honourable friend from Edinburgh talked about when he was looking at nightclubs, weddings and other events. The impact on the economy is quite severe, so we will continue to work as hard as we can. But the new national restrictions have obviously replaced the tier of the tier of local restrictions. I want to make sure that we can learn to live with the virus, that we can learn to that we can work towards the spring to get the vaccine, to get the rapid testing, so that we can start to come up to the new reality beyond the new normal.
Elliot Colburn.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. And time sadly restricts me from mentioning everyone's contribution, but can I thank all honourable and right honourable members for their contributions today. I think this has been an incredible debate, and I think we've really raised the petitioners' concerns. And on that note, can I also thank the petitioners for taking the time to bring this to the attention of the House and giving us the opportunity to discuss this today. I just want to emphasise at the end to the Minister that we want to make sure that post the pandemic, we want to make sure that there is actually industry there to recover. And on that basis, I'd like to move.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, didn't get to.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.